The Cheap Audio Man Music Podcast, Episode 2, talking about Metallica. This was written by Valentina Bernal, my awesome writer, channel manager, and I'm going to read you a script about Metallica. So sit down, grab a cup of coffee, and let's talk about the greatest rock and roll band of all time. When you hear the name Metallica, you probably picture four untouchable gods of heavy metal. Angry faces frozen mid-scream. Middle-aged dudes with long hair, thunder, fire, and enough volume to rearrange your DNA. I think that means they play loud. They've sold over 125 million records, filled stadiums for 4 decades, and helped define what thrash metal even is. Actually, I think they didn't create thrash metal. Anyway, to most people, Metallica feels larger than life. But in the beginning, they were just kids trying to figure it out. When James Hetfield first heard Lars Ulrich play drums, his first thought was, this guy's not very good. And he was kind of right. But Lars had something way more valuable than perfect timing. He had perfect timing. We'll get into that later. He knew a local promoter who was putting together a metal compilation record called Metal Massacre. And when he met James, he told him, we'll be on this record if we have a band. The problem was they didn't have a band. And that's how Metallica really started. Not from polished skill, but from persistence, hustle, and a little bit of delusion. And that combination turned out to be rocket fuel. Heavy metal, rocket fuel. They came from the underground tape trading scene. Fans were copying cassettes, mailing demos across continents, spreading the sound before social media even existed. They were pirates of heavy music, building a movement one copy at a time. Oh, I get it. Pirates, because, okay, the tapes. By 2000, they'd be suing Napster over the same kind of file sharing that built their early fan base. And that's the irony. They went from outlaws to establishment, from the band flipping the bird at the system to becoming the system. This is Metallica, the legends, the chaos, the family tragedies, the fights and fire, and the strange, sometimes hilarious missteps that came with being the loudest band in the world. A strange start. It's 1981. In Los Angeles, the Sunset Strip is filled with hairspray, spandex, and bands with names that sound like cologne. Motley Crue is actually, that's a really good idea for calling it Motley Crue. Motley Crue is exploding, and every club smells like sweat and Aquanet. But under all that glitter, something heavier was brewing. Faster, rougher, meaner. Music for kids who didn't want eyeliner or power ballads. They want danger and speed. Metallica never fit the strip. They weren't pretty. They weren't chasing radio. They were outsiders. And they liked it that way. James Hetfield was a quiet, brooding kid from Downey, California, raised by strict Christian Science parents. I didn't know that. Who didn't believe in medicine. Really? Or any actual science for that matter. Wow. When his mom got cancer, she refused treatment and died when she was 16? When he was 16. Actually, I just watched something. I think she actually died when he was 16. That's right. Because his dad left when he was 13. Anyway, I don't want to ruin this. That kind of pain, obviously, never left James. You can still hear it decades later in songs like The God That Failed. The loss shaped him, and it fueled the rage and melancholy that became Metallica's backbone. Across the Atlantic, Lars Ulrich was living a very different lifestyle. He grew up in Denmark, son of a professional tennis player, Torben Ulrich. Wow. Their house was filled with jazz, art, and comforts. He moved to California chasing tennis, but ended up chasing something louder. He wasn't a great drummer yet, but he had drive, connections, and a sense of timing that would change everything. Not when it came to playing the drums. The two met through a classified ad. James wasn't impressed by Lars's playing, but Lars had something James didn't. a guaranteed spot on that record, Metal Massacre. He'd already convinced Brian Slagle at Metal Blade Records to include their track if he could get a band together. With such an offer on the table, James said yes. And just like that, Metallica had a heartbeat. Weak, but real. In those early days, James brought in his high school friend, Ron McGovney, on bass. Ron wasn't looking to be a rock star. He worked a regular job, had a girlfriend, and mostly played as a favor to James. For lead guitar, they found Dave Mustaine through an ad in The Recycler. Dave walked in, plugged his amp in, and within seconds, they knew that Dave Mustaine was the guy. He was fast, technical, and mean, with riffs sharp enough to cut glass. Very good analogy. He also had a temper and a drinking problem. Fantastic. That made every rehearsal a gamble. But still, one very good but unpredictable guitar player is better than no guitar player at all. In 1982, they scraped together cash to record their first demo, No Life Till Leather, at Chateau East Studio in Tustin, California. The sessions were rough. The gear was falling apart, and half the time they had to pause because someone's amp overheated. Still, the demo was fast, raw, and alive. It spread through the underground tape trading network like wildfire. Kids in Northern Europe, Sweden, Norway, and Finland were the first to embrace it. Heavy metal always had its biggest, most loyal audience in those colder countries. I wonder why. If you know, put it in the comments. Why do those Scandinavians love heavy metal music? To them, Metallica sounded like survival. By the end of the year, Ron McGovney was absolutely done. They were all living and rehearsing at his house. Every night was a soap opera. Dave's dog bit James on the leg, and he constantly argued with Ron, and even poured beer on his bass, which is a no-no. Dave Mustaine ruined Ron McGovney's bass with beer. He was tired of the chaos and Mustaine's outburst, and that kind of rock star life was not meant for him. He stepped away quietly, long before the world knew who Metallica was. Money was tight, gigs were violent, and the crowds were unpredictable. Fans loved the energy, but venues apparently hated it. Metallica often left places wrecked, with broken tables, shattered glass, and bruised security guards. Promoters swore they'd never book them again, but that reputation only made the crowds bigger and wilder the next time they played. Then came Cliff Burton, 20 years old, long red hair, bell-bottom jeans, and a Rickenbacker bass that he played like a lead guitar. He had classical training, really, and refused to join unless they moved to San Francisco, where the Bay Area thrash scene was exploding around bands like Exodus and Possessed. I did not know that. He did not negotiate his offer and kept the attitude of, if you want me, you'll come here. So they did. They left Los Angeles behind, loaded their gear into a beat-up car, and headed north. That one decision changed everything. San Francisco embraced them immediately. The shows were louder, rougher, faster, and more devoted than anything they'd seen in LA. It was there that Metallica stopped being a noisy project and became a real band. But not before one more meltdown. Dave Mustaine's drinking spiraled out of control. He showed up drunk and started fights. And that was kind of the last straw. Well, not really. After such a long time, it gets hazy. Was it the fistfights, kicking James's dog, the damage to the van, the beer incident? It was probably all of it. Did James have a dog, or did Dave Mustaine's dog bite James? Anyway, on April 11, 1983, the members of Metallica woke up, handed Dave a bus ticket back to LA, and told them he was out. He didn't argue, just packed up and left. The next day, he started what would become Megadeth. Really? That's interesting. The same week, Metallica brought in Kirk Hammett from Exodus. He was 20, calm and razor sharp on guitar. The contrast was immediate. The energy clicked, and for the first time, Metallica felt whole. Hetfield, Ulrich, Burton, and Hammett. 4 kids about to change everything. The Four Horsemen. Their first breakthrough. The year 1983. Metallica was broke. They were half starved and sleeping on floors. They got no record deal, no management, and no plan beyond, let's just keep on playing. That's when Johnny Zazula enters the picture. Johnny had a record store in New Jersey, and he was running a mail-order metal business. And I'm assuming that's the genre of music and not siding for a chicken house. Anyway, he had a small label called Megaforce Records. And when he heard their demo, No Life Till Leather, he called the band himself and he said, "Listen, I don't have any money, but I do have faith." Metallica took the risk. They loaded everything they owned into a van and drove across the country from San Francisco to New York. It was a true leap of faith. The trip, however, nearly broke them. They pawned gear for gas, really, skipped meals, and slept in parking lots. When they finally got there, Johnny and his wife, Marcia, put them up in their basement in Old Bridge, New Jersey. It smelled like laundry and beer. Hopefully it was clean laundry, but it became home. They practiced there 4 weeks, living off of canned food and adrenaline. The first official recording sessions happened at Music America Studios in Rochester, New York. I did not know that. The studio was cold, small, and had almost no insulation, probably why it was cold. They wore coats while tracking guitars because the heating barely worked. Still, it was the most serious studio they had ever seen, and it felt like a miracle to be there. That album became Kill 'Em All. However, originally they wanted to call it Metal Up Your Ass, and the label politely refused. It was too crude, they said. So Cliff Burton joked, "Fine, we'll just kill 'em all instead." And somehow the joke became the name. They were still kids in their early 20s, recording songs that would define a generation. James growled his way through the session. Lars hammered drums like a man trying to break free from gravity. Cliff's bass rumbled like thunder, and Kirk's solos screamed. When they finished, they didn't know if anyone would care. The first pressing was only 15,000 copies, but it exploded. Tapes spread through the metal underground like wildfire. Zazula's phone rang nonstop. Fans dubbed copies, sent them across the country and even overseas, especially to Scandinavia and Germany. I didn't know Germany was such a metal, well, I guess it makes sense, Rammstein, where the audiences were already obsessed with the raw, violent sound of American thrash. In Northern Europe, Kill 'Em All was treated like a manifesto. Loud, fast, and without compromise. It didn't hit the Billboard charts, but it didn't need to. It built something more powerful. A movement. For the first time, Metallica was the band people whispered about, traded, and sought out in record bins. When they started writing their second record, they wanted to evolve. Lars suggested they record in Copenhagen. He still had family there, and he knew producer Flemming Rasmussen, who worked at Sweet Silent Studios. It wasn't a luxurious studio, but it was real. Lars' parents even visited during some sessions, watching proudly as their son, the one who quit tennis for drums, worked like a machine behind the kit. It's cool that his parents were still supportive, even if he was chasing his dream as a metal drummer. Those sessions became Ride the Lightning. It was still fast, but heavier and smarter. Cliff Burton's musicality transformed the sound. He added harmonies, counter melodies, and even used his wah pedal on the bass, something unheard of in metal at the time. The intro for Whom the Bell Tolls, that's all Cliff. He wrote it like a lead guitarist. They also recorded Fade to Black, a ballad about despair and the urge to give up. It was inspired by James's gear being stolen, but it carried deeper meaning, grief, exhaustion, and the weight of losing control. Some fans called it soft, even selling out already, but most understood it for what it was. The sound of a young man trying to make sense of pain. Money was still tight. They slept in cheap apartments, shared food, and relied on whatever cash they could get. Between sessions, they skated around Copenhagen, drank cheap beer, and blew off steam by wrecking hotel furniture they couldn't afford. That's how I spend all my time when I need to relax. Check into a hotel and wreck the furniture. When Ride the Lightning dropped in 1984, it was clear they'd outgrown the underground. Elektra Records noticed. They saw the potential and offered Metallica a deal. Proper funding, distribution, and real promotion. It was the first time the band could actually buy new instruments instead of fixing broken ones with duct tape. The record didn't just reach more people, it reshaped what heavy metal could be. The songwriting was sophisticated, the lyrics introspective. It had everything: weight, feeling, melody. And that year, Metallica was no longer just a cult band. They were a rising force. And with that came the road. The shows were wild. Fans were rowdy, often violent. Some nights the pits turned into chaos, and security couldn't handle it. Venues sometimes refused to rebook them, really, because of the damage. But that energy, that sense of danger, was exactly what drew people in. By 1985, they joined massive European festivals where tens of thousands of fans sang along to songs that had only been recorded months earlier. They were now carrying the workload of artists twice their age, touring nonstop, rehearsing, writing, and recording without rest. Then came the real test. In late 1985, they went back to Sweet Silence Studios in Copenhagen to record another album. By now, they knew exactly who they were, and they had something to prove. This time, it wasn't going to be just some loud, fast metal record. It's going to be something different, and they were going to prove it. Success and sorrow. Their sessions in the studio were brutal. They'd also been touring nonstop. Their bodies were wrecked from the road. They were exhausted. And James, well, he was drinking more. Lars never stopped being Lars, which meant he was moving around, talking all the time. Kirk, however, was quiet, focused. Cliff kind of seemed to be living in a different world. He was writing riffs that sounded like thunder mixed with Bach, because he was, classically trained. The studio itself was a blur of long nights, cigarette smoke, and half-finished bottles of Tuborg beer. What is that? Is that like some Scandinavian beer? They worked for months, chasing perfection they could barely define. What came out of those sessions, however, was Master of Puppets, which some people, myself included, believe that is the greatest heavy metal album of all time. If you disagree, please put it in the comments. Released in March of 1986, it hit like a freight train. It wasn't just faster or louder, it was deeper. The title track was nearly 9 minutes long, which is not necessarily radio friendly. It was a song about control, addiction, and losing yourself. It was the first time a thrash metal band had written something that complex and made it work, at least in their opinion. Even now, Master of Puppets is considered one of the best metal albums ever recorded. It's considered the best. It had a bit of a resurgence too, because it was used in Stranger Things the last season. Eddie gets up on a trailer, single wide trailer, and starts hammering out Master of Puppets, and then all of the devil bats attacked him. Okay. Cliff Burton's fingerprints were everywhere on that record. He wasn't playing bass, he was orchestrating. Songs like Orion and Welcome Home, Sanitarium, Leave Me Be, carried his sense of melody and space. He was the quiet center of the band, the one who studied, the one who thought beyond the noise. He had heart. He gave Metallica more than sound. He gave them direction. The tour that followed was massive. They hit the road with Ozzy Osbourne crossing the U.S. in buses that smelled like suspicious smoke, beer, and exhaustion. I wonder what exhaustion smells like. Probably ketchup and onions. They drank constantly. They argued. They destroyed hotel rooms. They were 20-somethings living like they were invincible. Every night, James thrashed so hard his voice would give out. Every morning, he got up and did it again. While Ozzy partied like only Ozzy could, Metallica was trying to survive their first big tour. They were still young, still reckless, but at least the chaos came from outside the band. Mostly. Ozzy even said they reminded him of Sabbath. They broke things, instruments, walls, themselves. Promoters booked them knowing they'd lose money on repairs. But the crowd didn't care. When Metallica came through your city, you went, even if it meant bruises. Their shows were pure adrenaline. And by the middle of 1986, they were still opening for Ozzy's The Ultimate Sin Tour. Then, James broke his wrist. Again. Skateboarding. It was the second time in less than 2 years. He could barely move his hand, and that's kind of important considering, he plays guitar. He could barely move his hand, but he refused to cancel shows. Wow, really? He sang without playing, pacing the stage like a caged animal. The others joked about it, but the exhaustion was setting in. By the time they flew to Europe for the next leg of the tour, they were burnt out physically and mentally. Still, the music and the thrill kept them going. They were too young to slow down. Then came Sweden. On September 26, 1986, they played in Stockholm. After a good show, they got on the bus and headed to Copenhagen. It was freezing. The roads were covered in ice, and the fog was thick as smoke. Inside, they were joking, half asleep, passing around drinks and a deck of cards. Cliff and Kirk were playing to decide who'd get the top bunk that night. Cliff won. Hours later, before dawn, the bus hit black ice. It skidded, flipped, and crashed. Then, silence. They woke to chaos, glass, metal, screaming, cold air. James crawled barefoot onto the road, his breath visible in the dark. He started shouting that he swore he smelled alcohol on the driver's breath. Kirk stood frozen, staring at the wreck. Cliff had been thrown through a window and crushed under the bus. They tried to lift it, screaming his name, but there was nothing they could do. Cliff Burton was gone at 24 years old. The band stood in the snow, staring at the wreckage of everything they'd built. Their roadie, one of the first on the scene, helped drag them out and called for help. Helicopters arrived soon after, cutting through the fog, taking the survivors to safety. But the damage was already done. The tour was cut short. The press speculated if they'd ever play again. For days, the band barely spoke. They sat stunned, waiting for word on what to do next. They'd lost more than a bandmate. They'd lost their balance. James blamed himself for insisting on that bus. Lars, for the first time, fell into silence. Kirk later said it was the most painful moments of my life. At Cliff's funeral in California, hundreds of fans gathered. His parents, Jan and Ray Burton, stood with the band. They were grieving too, obviously. But when they spoke to James, Lars, and Kirk, they told him something that stuck. Cliff would want you to keep playing. That single sentence changed everything. They could have stopped right there. No one would have blamed them. But instead, they took it as a mission and decided to go on. Maturity, not anger. In October of 1986, barely 3 weeks after the crash, they, as in Metallica, started auditioning a new bassist. It felt too soon, but if they didn't move, the entire tour would collapse. Dozens of players showed up. One of them was Jason Newsted from the Arizona band Flotsam and Jetsam. And I just looked it up. Their first name, Flotsam and Jetsam, was formed in 1981, but it was formed under the name of Paradox/Dreadlocks/Dogs with a Z. And I really like that name. Jason walked in already knowing every note on their set list. He played like he'd been rehearsing with them for years. He had energy, precision, and total respect for the music. He wasn't just trying out for a gig. He was trying out for his dream. They hired him within a week. His first show was on Halloween night. Oh, that's cool. In Reseda, California. One week he was a local kid from Phoenix. The next he was standing under spotlights, replacing a legend. For Jason, it was everything that he'd wanted. For the others, it still felt like a wound. Cliff's ghost lingered in every dressing room, every hotel, every sound check. And Jason was treated as the replacement. He was hazed constantly. His bass was turned down in the mix during live shows and on Master of Puppets and Justice for All. His gear was messed with. He later said he felt both lucky and cursed. At night, while the others partied, Jason would climb onto the roof of the bus with a sleeping bag and rest under the open air. It was the only quiet he could find. He still showed up every morning ready to go, smiling, head-banging harder than anyone. Slowly, fans began to see him as part of the band. Inside, though, it was chaos. The drinking got heavier. The fights louder. They were grieving, and none of them had the words for it or a way to process it. The studio became the only place where they could pour that pain out. And that record became And Justice for All, their most complicated album yet. The songs were long, technical, full of tempo shifts and time signatures that made producers shake their heads. It was brilliant and brutal. But Jason's bass lines, carefully recorded and full of power, were basically almost erased. They were mixed so low, they're barely audible. Fans noticed immediately. Critics complained that the record sounded thin. But years later, James admitted it wasn't about the music or an artistic choice. It was about grief. They couldn't stand to hear anyone else filling Cliff's space. Even with that pain underneath, Justice broke them into the mainstream. The single, One, brought them to MTV for the first time. Man, I remember that thing. It was played on a loop on MTV. It was awesome. One brought them to MTV. Okay, that video, Bleak, black and white, made the whole world see Metallica. Suddenly, kids who had never been near a metal show were watching them on television. That's true. Quickly after came the Grammys. It was the first year the Academy introduced a Best Hard Rock / Metal Performance category. Everyone assumed Metallica would win. It was the obvious choice. However, they didn't win. What? The Grammys not giving the best band an award? That never happens. The award went to Jethro Tull, a prog rock band best known for flutes and medieval-style folk riffs. The audience actually laughed. Even the presenter looked confused. It was a mess, but in the end, it worked in Metallica's favor. That night, they became the symbol for the outsider once again. Too real, too heavy, too raw for the establishment to even understand. They didn't lose credibility. They gained some street credibility. The Justice Tour, later called the Damaged Justice Tour, lasted nearly 2 years. Wow, and over 200 shows. They crossed continents, filled arenas, and lived in constant motion. Jason played every night like he was still auditioning. He swung his bass like a weapon, thrashed until his neck locked up, and somehow kept smiling through it all. One of the things I remember about him is he had this big neck. He seemed like the meanest Metallica member. Okay. By the end, the fans who once held signs for Cliff now shouted Jason's name. He had earned his place among the public. But behind the success was exhaustion. They'd been living on buses for years, Hangovers never ended. Every show was louder, faster, heavier, and they kept pushing until there was nothing left to push with. By the end of the tour, Metallica had survived grief, found a new sound, and conquered the world. But they were also burnt out completely. And soon that burnout would collide with fame and fire in the most literal way. Too much heat to be Justice. When the Justice tour finally ended, they could breathe again, but only a little. Lars was restless. James was skateboarding again, apparently. Kirk kept to his guitar, trying to find calm in the noise. Even Jason continued to write and compose. They were rich for the first time in their lives, but none of them were settled. No homes, no long-term partners, just apartments, guitars, and chaos. Their 20s had been consumed by music. Everything else still waiting to start. For a brief moment, they slowed down. The break gave them space to look around and realize what they had become. The biggest metal band in the world. But still, 4 kids trying to keep it together. The question that came next: they had already conquered the underground and the charts. The long, complex songs of Justice had stretched them to the limit. For the next record, they wanted something different, sharper, simpler, heavier. Something that hit in the chest. That's when Bob Rock's name came up. Bob Rocks, not Bob Ross. Bob Rock. The man was famous for making albums sound massive. His credits included Motley Crue's Dr. Feelgood and the Cult's Sonic Temple. Not exactly thrash metal, but Metallica recognized the genius of Bob Rock, and they wanted a little of that genius for themselves. At first, it felt wrong to bring in someone from the glam world. Rock had also worked with the Cult, Bon Jovi, and other bands Metallica once mocked. But he also had experience making chaos sound perfect. They needed that. They were also nervous about his connection to the Cult's producer circle, which they saw as the part of the polished commercial side of rock. Lars doubted it would work. James didn't like outsiders, but the idea of making a record that big was too tempting to ignore. The sessions started in 1990 at One on One Studios in Los Angeles. It wasn't easy, but that was the norm for Metallica now. Bob Rock tore their songs apart. He made them play together in the same room instead of tracking separately. He pushed James to sing instead of shout. He forced Lars to redo takes until the drums sounded like thunder. He told Kirk to stop hiding behind effects and play every solo like it mattered. They fought constantly. James hated being told what to do. Lars argued about everything. Jason sat quietly, taking notes, waiting for his moment to contribute. The tension was worth it. When they finally finished, the sound was amazing. I think everyone knows just how big the Black Album was. By August 1991, Metallica released their self-titled record. The world would call it the Black Album. The songs were shorter, slower, and more focused. Enter Sandman. Sad but true. Nothing else matters wherever I may roam. Every track sounded built for stadiums. And the change worked. The Black Album exploded. It continues to sell like crazy, actually. I think it's been the longest album in the top 25 most popular albums. Something like that. There's some crazy statistic. Anyway, it sold like crazy and defined an entire decade. Metallica went from being a cult phenomenon to a household name. And with that came the biggest tour of their lives. The Wherever We May Roam tour began in 1991 and never seemed to end. It grew into Nowhere Else to Roam, stretching across 3 years and nearly 300 shows. They played to millions. They carried a workload few bands ever had. The stage production was massive. Walls of speakers, towers of lights, pyro shows that could melt the front row. Actually, there was no front row. Valentina, general admission. Anyway, Every cue had to be perfect. One mistake could set the stage on fire. Really? And one night, it actually did. On August 8th, 1992, in Montreal, the band was performing Fade to Black. The stage was mapped out with precise special effects marks. That's a bit of a tongue twister. During one of those cues, James walked forward a second too soon, stepped into the path of a 12-foot flame meant to shoot straight up. There hadn't been enough rehearsal. They were tired. The stage had changed slightly from the night before, and James misjudged his mark by less than a meter. And in real people talk, that's about 3 feet. In an instant, fire engulfed his left arm, face, and hand. The band stopped playing. The lights cut out. The crowd froze. At first, people thought it was part of the show. Then they saw James running towards the wings, clutching his arm, smoke rising from his shirt. Crew members rushed him backstage as medics pushed through the confusion. Yowza, I didn't know he got lit on fire. For several minutes, the arena went silent. When Lars came forward and told the crowd what had happened, James had been seriously burned and the show was over. He was rushed to the hospital with second and third degree burns on his arm and hand. His face was spared, but his arm was badly damaged. The night should have ended there, but it didn't. Guns N' Roses were co-headlining the tour. They had the chance to continue the concert and calm the crowd. Instead, Axl Rose cut their set short after only a few songs, claiming sound problems. And that lit the fuse. No pun intended, considering that James got lit on fire. Tens of thousands of furious fans spilled into the streets. They smashed chairs, threw bottles, and set fires outside the venue. Cars were overturned. Police were overwhelmed. Montreal became a riot zone overnight. Those crazy Canadians wanted their money's worth when they went to the rock show. And so they destroyed stuff. Metallica's name was dragged into the headlines. James later said he felt terrible about it all. He blamed himself for stepping too soon and for leaving the stage injured, even though he had no choice. Man, kind of nice. He spent weeks healing. His arm was wrapped in bandages. His skin still tender. He couldn't play guitar, but he refused to stop the tour. So John Marshall, their trusted roadie and guitarist from Metal Church, stepped in to play rhythm. Cool. James focused only on vocals, moving around the stage like a general without his weapon. Fans were shocked to see him without a guitar, but when he finally returned to playing months later, the roar was deafening. It wasn't just a cheer for the sound returning, it was a cheer for his stubbornness, for healing, for refusing to give up. The Black Album tour became legend. Almost 300 shows. Imagine that. 3 years of travel. 1 million faces across continents and countries that didn't even speak English. In 1991, they played Monsters of Rock Festival in Moscow, performing before nearly 1 million people at an old Soviet airfield. If you haven't seen those YouTube videos, you need to check them out. It's bananas to see that many people. There's like Soviet helicopters flying over, fireworks going on. It was bananas. Tanks lined the perimeter. Helicopters hovered above the crowd. It looked more like a military operation than a concert. They were very aware that this crowd could easily become another riot. But when Metallica started playing, the soldiers dropped their rifles, left their stations, and started cheering. By 1993, they had filled stadiums on it. And actually, that concert was either right after the fall of the Soviet Union or right before it. Anyway, it was really important. I think AC/DC was there too. It was a big deal. By 1993, they had filled stadiums on every continent, sold tens of millions of records, and turned heavy metal into global culture. A great tour, but also great strain. Behind the lights and the noise, they were exhausted once more. 3 straight years of touring had burned through everything that they had. They were running on fumes. When it finally ended, Metallica stood at the peak of the mountain. But the air was thin up there, and they were about to find out how cold it could get on top of the metal mountain. Anyway, that's the end of episode 1. Make sure to subscribe, turn on all of the notifications so that you can see Metallica episode 2. Thank you so much for watching.